Hi, everybody. I'm David Gushee, and I'm so glad to be here with Andrew Whitehead. We occupy some similar worlds and have some similar background academically, but we've never met, and so it's exciting to me to be in conversation with you, Andrew. And thanks for spending some time today.
Yeah, it's really good to be with you, and yeah, looking forward to continue conversation.
So, Andrew, you and I are both really concerned about both the health of American democracy
Mm.
and the health of the Christian soul in America, you might say. Um, when did you decide and how did you decide to move into the kind of the latter question, to write a book, this new one, American Idolatry, which I so warmly recommend to everybody who's watching. Um, you're a sociologist who is functioning in this book kind of like a theologian or a guide to the health of the Christian community in the US.
Mm.
How'd you decide to make that transition?
Yeah, it was in some ways difficult because as academics, we always want to stay in our lane to say, right? But I think, I came to the conclusion, understanding that after years of research academically around Christian nationalism, what I was seeing over and over really convinced me that there's another step to take where I've been on this personal journey within American Christianity, trying to make sense of what it means to be Christian and American, and how those might interact, or how they interact, and how they might contradict one another. And so, as I was looking at all the evidence that social science was handing me in these studies that I was performing with colleagues and co-authors, I thought it came to the point where I couldn't not write about it from this other perspective and from this other journey as a self-identifying Christian, because I saw the damage that it can do to how we interact with our neighbors, how we think about God. And while I'm not a theologian by training, theology is thinking about God, and that's something all Christians do. And so at this point, it felt as though I wanted to share some of my journey, and I think that's the key point, is that we're all on a journey and we're coming to it at different points. And so if I can share a bit of my own and where I'm headed, it might connect with other folks who are on a similar journey. And I think that's where we are really seeing a lot of this conversation bubble up, is people who have been walking in this space, coming to terms and wrestling with our history, with where we are right now, but then to a vision of flourishing, not just for Christians, but a vision of flourishing for all people as we go forward. And if Christians are going to be about that, we have to really reckon with some of these things that are around us right now, like Christian nationalism, like authoritarianism, like these anti-democratic impulses that we see bubbling up. And so I think that's what ultimately encouraged me to write this, and to try and be a part of that conversation.
Um, Fundamentally, what would you say is the best way to describe the to the uninitiated what exactly has gone wrong with the American Christian soul, especially the white American conservative Christian soul? And how does it connect to the term Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Well, as we study it and as we've empirically defined Christian nationalism as this desire to see a very particular expression of Christianity privileged in the public sphere, and to see the American government defend that framework and that particular expression of Christianity, I think at the heart of it, it is anti-democratic. It isn't interested in sharing power. It wants privileged access to power in order to make its view of society the view of society that everyone has to share. And so I think as Christians wrestle with what it means to be Christian in the public sphere, they have to think about power and how it should be wielded, and what it should be used for. And so I think that is the real challenge. And so I think too, I'm wondering from your perspective and the writing and work that you've done, I think it gets to that same issue, right? How to be Christian in the public sphere, what we've seen happen, what we've been handed, but now how do we do better moving forward? And so I'm wondering as well, if power is at the center of white Christian nationalism, especially the self-interested power, what does that mean for us, and how can Christians think about that and perhaps move forward?
You by using the word idolatry, I mean, you name the ultimate sin, I think, biblically.
Hmm.
You shall have no other gods before me. It's the first commandment. And Jesus, in many ways, reinforces the centrality of worshiping God alone.
Hmm.
And I think one reason why the ban on idols is the first commandment is because was it Calvin who said the human heart is a factory for making idols? I rarely
Yeah.
quote Calvin, but I'll quote some John Calvin there.
Yeah.
The human heart is a factory for making idols.
Hmm.
We don't want to worship the one true God. We often want to worship any other God, a God who will serve us rather than us serving God, and a God who we can identify with our other loyalties.
Hmm.
So what I think you're identifying is that white Christian nationalism, in essence, is really worshiping America and whiteness
Hmm.
and power in an unholy amalgam, and confusing these with Jesus or with God, and it's all one thing. And in many in different ways, I've skirted into or near that argument at different times in my career as a Christian ethicist. But I think on the other side of the Trump debacle, many of us are converging on this space to realize that it is an idolatry, and it is a very dangerous one, and there's violence associated with it. And it helps to explain January 6th, and it helps to explain the violence that is seething and simmering in our politics even now. My book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, essentially would concur that there is a version of Christianity, not just in the US, but in many countries, that is fundamentally wrong-headed, idolatrous, about national identity and the majority or historic majority population in countries that is used to being in charge and wants to continue to be in charge and is unwilling to accept pluralism and diversity of religion and diversity of lifestyle, and is freaked out by social changes that have happened at least since the 1960s, if not before,
Right.
and has come to a place of saying, you know, if this is what democracy brings, maybe we don't really want democracy.
Right.
Would you agree that it's that, I mean, it doesn't start off well, maybe it does. Do you think it starts off anti-democratic, this idolatry, or does it become anti-democratic when it doesn't like what democracy produces?
That's a really good question. And I almost agree with both. It almost seems like a both and, because I think at its heart, I think it is anti-democratic in the sense that it has a particular vision, and it legitimates it in the will of the Christian God. And so what could or should stand in the way? Nothing. If God has designed the world to look this way, then that isn't fundamentally, it can't align with democracy, because there is no compromise with God declaring this is the way it should be. And again, that's their interpretation of scriptures and their community and all those things. But then I think too, as long as democracy returned results that they felt aligned with what they saw as God's decree, then they were okay with it. But once, like you said, we see these dramatic changes, both sociodemographically in the country, but then religiously, diversity along all these vectors is increasing. All of a sudden now it becomes clear that those voices are no longer the taken for granted center of the culture, to where they have privileged access to power. Now, institutionally, they still do. But I think in the popular, when we survey large numbers of the American public, it is no longer the majority by any stretch. And so I think at that point, then they start to see that democracy is about compromise, about different voices, and does demand that we are a seat at the table, not always at the head of the table. And all those things, I think, create then this desire to set that aside. I think then the anti-democratic heart of it is revealed, and then we see it come to the fore. So, I was interested too, as we talk about this, I know in your book and in his mind as well, looking backwards, right? We have to read really good history to understand why we are where we are. And, I look mostly at history on these shores, right? Back before the United States is founded. But you're looking elsewhere, in yours to understand these histories and what has taken place to put into context where we are today. And so, yeah, I was interested too, as you do that, what begins to come to the forefront, right? As we try to understand where we're at, what types of similarities, did you find as we look elsewhere and as we look back?
I think it is remarkable how often we see a very similar pattern, which I call authoritarian reactionary Christianity. And even though it's not exactly the same label as Christian nationalism, I think it ends up in the same, not just in the same zip code, but on the same street. I think
Right.
um
They're happy neighbors.
they are very happy neighbors, and they look at the world the same way. The idea is the default starting point was there was a time when people like us were in charge,
Yeah.
and people like us are the rightful people in charge.
Yeah.
And, if it's in Hungary, it's a certain population. If it's in Russia, it's a certain population. If it's in Poland, or I have studies of 19th century France and Germany too. And this is understood to be a Christian culture with a very close bond between church and state. And the people are European or French or German or Russian or Hungarian or whatever, but ethnically we would say white European. And other people that are here as subordinated populations.
Right.
In
Right.
Europe, the historic subordinated population was Jewish. And so anti-Semitism is a part of the story in Europe, as it is actually here too.
Yeah.
So race really had more of that vibe, but gradually, the allegiance of the population to Christianity declines. Maybe the religion is disestablished or gradually weakens. The state democratizes. The marriage between throne and altar weakens. Pluralism is valued as opposed to just tolerated. Non-Christian or non-majority Christian get to be leaders. Maybe they win elections. They become prime ministers. Maybe there's some significant immigration, so people of other races and continents and so on make the way, and they end up being visible in the arts or business or sports or politics. And so the original kind of we're in charge here, this is our country population begins to be increasingly uneasy. And maybe leaders emerge who say, this is not how this country is supposed to be. We need to get it back to make France great again, make Germany great again, make Russia great again. And we end democracy. This whole democracy thing, one thing I was able to find is Christian support for democracy was pretty shaky in many quarters for a long time anyway.
Yeah.
And because democracy could yield uncertain results depending on who had a vote, right?
For sure.
And so maybe democracy begins to be seen more ambivalently or problematically. What we really need is a Christian state again. We need strong men, Christian leaders to bring things back under control again. A negative reaction to pluralism and modern cultural changes, an attraction to authoritarian leaders who can fix this, ergo authoritarian reactionary Christianity. Does that track with your reading of what we've seen in the U.S.?
Yeah, it really does. I think when we're looking at white Christian nationalism in the U.S., one of the main idols that I write about is fear and sense of threat. And I think what you're highlighting really brings that idol to bear, where we begin to see ourselves, right, white Christians, as a minority losing control, sensing that things are slipping away. And one of the fundamental elements of white Christian nationalism in the US is this idea of, well, it's a comfort with authoritarian social control. So seeing the world as a chaotic place where sometimes we need strong rules, but especially strong rulers who will come in and enact social order according to a moral hierarchy that they already agree with, right? With certain folks at the top, generally white, Christian, Protestant, natural born citizens. Those folks need to be at the top. And so we need a strong ruler to come in under violence or the threat of violence to enact that order. And we find too that it always falls along ethno-racial lines, where there are certain folks that deserve to be at the top. And so that sense of fear and threat at losing privileged access to being able to say, this is the way the world should look, and then a comfort with authoritarian social control and the use or the threat of violence is a natural outflow then, because when we're unable to, or when democracy, let's say, doesn't return the results that we want, well, then we need to use some other form of power. And violence is obviously low-hanging fruit, for these groups to be able to then use and to draw those sharp boundary lines. And so I think this is what we see happening over and over across US history, but especially within the last, 30 or 40 years, culminating in what we saw on January 6th. And so those idols, I think, are always really close to the surface.
What is your data showing? Do you have like a specific kind of killer good question that gets at something like, it may be necessary to set aside democracy in order to return this country to what God wants it to be, or something like that? Do you have a question that you asked that pinpoints that?
Well, I think really close. There's a series of questions. One that we see over and over that my colleague Sam Perry has asked, and PRRI has asked on their latest research. I cite this in my book, is that, asking for level of agreement with whether at some point we may have to resort to violence in order to return this country to the right track, right? To make sure it gets back on track. And so this should be chilling to all Americans, but especially Christians, to say that we should set aside essentially democracy, this idea that we can have differences, but come to a shared understanding of, or at least compromise on where we should go next, or at least respecting the rule of law, setting all that aside, and through violence to enact what we want. And that's essentially what it's saying. And so Americans that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are much more likely to agree that sometimes political violence is necessary in order to overcome an outcome of an election that they don't agree with. And then too, when we look at attitudes towards democracy, like whether certain groups of Americans should lose access to the vote, like if they were ever convicted of a crime, those folks should never be able to vote again, or if they should be forced to pass a basic civics test in order to vote. And if you have any if we have any knowledge of Jim Crow South, right, that is exactly what was done to ensure that whole subpopulations of the US could not vote and have access to it. So it really becomes a question of voting is not a right, but it's a privilege. And when we define it as a privilege, then we can define who deserves that right. And we see over and over that white Christian nationalism has a very particular view on who deserves to vote, not that all Americans have a right to have a say. And so I think it is, empirically at the heart, anti-democratic in some of those views. But then I'm wondering too, with your work, as we look forward, we think about that, what would be the message, or what would you tell American Christians, not only sounding the alarm, I would say, but then how do we cast a vision for where we go, or what do we need to kind of recommit to, I think, in some sense, in order to confront and oppose this threat?
A lot of what I do in the book is, in the first part, I just do some kind of homely civics about what democracy is as a political system, because I think we've kind of taken it for granted, and not too many people have really thought that much about, okay, what exactly constitutes a democratic society? Is it having a constitution? Is it having, votes where everybody gets a chance to vote? Is it exactly? So we need to do some civics and remember what a democracy is and how it is different from an authoritarian government. And we need a history refresher as to why it was that in the West, in countries like Great Britain and France and all across Europe eventually, and here, we decided that a democracy with the rule of law and civil rights protections for all and so on, with an independent judiciary and all of that, that was the best way to organize politics.
Mm.
That was the end result of a long historical trial and error process. And I think most Christians especially are not really aware of that trial and error process, or they've rejected it. They would be happier to be in 12th century Europe than in 21st century America.
Mm.
There's a reason why disestablishment of religion and equal citizenship for all was arrived at over 200 years ago in our country, right? Almost 250 years. So learn what democracy is. Remember the history that got us to support for democracy as Christians, the role that Christians played in overcoming monarchy and authoritarianism for democracy, and then some of the resources of the Christian faith that are pro-democratic, like democratic congregationalism I talk about, and the covenantal tradition understood to include everybody.
Yeah.
And I also feature the African American democratic tradition in the U.S. as a major resource.
Yeah.
That everybody should study, how a people so badly mistreated in this country would end up fighting again and again, year after year, generation after generation, for democracy.
Yeah.
So call on our own best resources. That's what I'm trying to argue. I noticed that part of what you're arguing is, hey, there's a lot of good scripture here about what it is to be a follower of Jesus. And it's like, you want to talk about low-hanging fruit, the way Jesus treated people and the way Jesus understood the kingdom of God. And so here's my question for you. I mean, do you ever think that people who are deeply enmeshed in the weeds of a deep Christian nationalism, are they able to hear such appeals? I mean, are they too far gone? I mean, do you expect that somebody's gonna, yeah, that's true, let's look at what Jesus said, maybe this is a little bit off. I see a hopefulness even in the theological biblical appeal that you're offering, and I want to share in that hopefulness, but it's hard for me to share in it some days.
Yeah, no, in the time of day where, honestly, cynicism creeps in, and it's hard for me, especially when I look at the data, to think that we'll be able to turn it around. And I think in some sense there isn't going to be some quick turn, but there are things that do give me hope. And then too, with my my Christian beliefs and how I identify, hope then too is supposed to be something that I practice. And so I have to, against the data or against, the feelings that I have, practice that hope. And looking at as you point out, the Black church tradition, where some of these folks were planting seeds and sowing, knowing that they would never reap the rewards, but still pushing. And so I think, okay, so then I need to as well. But I think, as speaking empirically, there are folks who so strongly embrace Christian nationalism and the conspiratorial thinking that goes with it, and are so enmeshed in essentially echo chambers where all they're hearing and everything they're seeing and then choosing to then believe and accept are essentially detached from reality, that it can be difficult, probably impossible, to have a conversation with them in that sense. And so there's going to be folks that, yeah, it may not, other than us just embodying difference from them and saying, I'm Christian, but I stand against you. It will just be that. That's all we can do. But there are folks, I think, too, that I see in that middle, or who identify as accommodators, who might they aren't necessarily the ones trying to pass legislation pushing to make America, quote unquote, more Christian, but they stay silent because they figure, well, if some religion is elevated, it might as well be Christianity. I think those folks, those are the ones that do essentially believe in fairness and injustice, but they just don't know that those are being threatened by this rhetoric or by this group. And so as we're able to share more and raise those voices, or at least to show that this small minority who speaks very loudly isn't these aren't the only Christians or the only Americans that have something to say. I do think those folks, I have, experienced that anecdotally. And then too, we need to gather more data to test this, but they can be persuaded, they could be moved maybe to be resistors or maybe even rejectors of Christian nationalism. And so I do think it will take kind of this broader movement, but then too, as we can in relationship, but then also systemically, where we're voting for policies that lift up the marginalized and oppressed, and we listen to those voices, because it can't just be an individual heart change. Democracy will fall by the wayside by the time we have broad scale generational heart change. But systemically and then interpersonally, I think we have to keep both of those responses in mind, and then as best we can practice hope, which isn't easy most days. I think for both of us.
That may be a good place to land the plane as I think about it. January 6th was a wake-up call, and it was the jagging forth to the surface of some trends that had been developing for a while.
Yeah.
And scholars like you, good scholars like you, are doing the kind of work to help us identify how we got here. Now, another presidential election is coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And the same person who fomented January 6, 2021 may be on the ballot again.
Yep.
And it's a kind of a street by street, house by house. Are we going to get this close to losing our democracy again? It partly depends on the loyalties of all these good heart and soul Christian people that you and I both knew growing up,
Right.
What you tell about your childhood in the rural Midwest, right? And I knew these folks in Northern Virginia and the little Southern Baptist church I was in. It's kind of like, who are they at this point? Have they learned anything?
Yeah.
Since 2021, have they seen that there may be a better way to advance Christian values in the public square than that?
Yeah.
I hope so. But the scholars are doing. I think the scholars are doing. We are doing our job. And Christian scholars are trying to speak to the hearts and minds of Christian people. And I'm so glad you're in this fight, and I'm glad that we're working shoulder to shoulder. And I just want to again applaud you for your body of work, including the, taking America back with God and the whole trajectory since you got going. And so congratulations on this new book, American Idolatry, subtitle, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. When did it come out?
It came out just a couple weeks ago, August 15th. So it's, just out.
You're doing lots of interviews right now. Thanks for taking time to have this conversation with me today.
Yeah. And the same to you. Thank you for your work, and your past books, I think, are just speaking into this, trend and tradition that we've been on, culminating now, and congrats on your new book as well. And it's, I'm just like you. I'm so glad to know that I'm not alone on this journey, that there are a number of us and that we're pulling in the same direction. And so, all the best as your book releases here soon, I think, right?
October 3rd.
Nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thanks, Andrew. God bless you, and all the best to you. Okay.
You as well.